He only wanted to cash a simple check. No drama, no special treatment, just the kind of everyday task anyone does without a second thought. But instead of respect, he was met with suspicion, laughter, and humiliation in front of strangers. What no one in that bank knew was that the man they mocked wasn't just another customer. He was someone with the power to turn their assumptions upside down. This moment wouldn't just expose one person's prejudice. It would uncover a truth about racism that cuts far deeper. The question is, are we ready to face it? Before that day, Marcus lived the kind of life many would call successful. In his early 40s, he carried himself with quiet confidence, tall, well-dressed, deliberate in his movements. To his colleagues, he was a leader. To his family, he was a provider and role model. To himself, he was proof of what perseverance could accomplish. Marcus had grown up in a neighborhood where opportunity felt out of reach. His mother worked long hours in retail, his father labored in a factory, and both instilled in him a belief that discipline and education were his ticket forward. That belief carried him through nights of studying when exhaustion whispered to quit, through boardrooms where he was often the only black man at the table, and through decades of climbing a corporate ladder designed to push him off at every rung. By the time this story begins, Marcus had the career, the home, and the stability his parents once dreamed of for him. Yet, no matter how high he climbed, he carried an unavoidable truth. To some, he would never be more than the color of his skin. On this particular afternoon, Marcus decided to run a simple errand himself. No assistants, no driver, no team behind him. Just a stop at a neighborhood bank branch to cash a check. It was the kind of task that should have taken minutes. Nothing unusual, nothing remarkable. The autumn air outside was cool, the sun hanging low as he straightened his tie, a small ritual of order he always performed. He thought about his children waiting for him at home, about dinner later with his wife, about the upcoming weekend. Everything about the day felt ordinary. Inside the bank, fluorescent lights hummed over beige walls. A short line wound its way toward the counter, a handful of customers shifting impatiently with paperwork in their hands. Marcus stepped into line, holding his envelope neatly prepared with the check and his identification. But soon, he noticed the subtle weight of glances. A quick double take from one man, a lingering look from a woman across the lobby. He'd seen those looks all his life. The silent questions. Do you belong here? Are you out of place? He ignored them, as he always had. Experience had taught him that responding to every flicker of doubt was exhausting. Instead, he reminded himself of the countless rooms he had entered where he was underestimated, rooms he always left with respect earned. This, he thought, would be no different. When his turn came, Marcus stepped forward with quiet confidence. He handed his envelope to the manager who had just come to the counter, a woman in her early 30s, sharp-eyed, her posture crisp. Marcus greeted her politely, explaining his request. Her reaction was immediate. She scanned the check, then looked back at him, her lips curving into a smile that wasn't friendly but dismissive. Her eyes held that familiar flicker, not of professionalism, but of suspicion. Marcus stayed composed. He'd seen it before. Questions loaded into tone, assumptions dressed up as procedure. She asked if he even had an account there, not with curiosity, but with an undercurrent of doubt. He calmly pointed to his account details, waiting for her to process. Instead, she chuckled softly. Not out of kindness, but in a way that sliced through the quiet of the bank. It wasn't just disbelief, it was mockery. Other customers glanced over. The room shifted. What had been a routine transaction was now a scene. Marcus felt it in the air, the subtle tightening, the way strangers positioned themselves as if to witness a performance. The manager waved for another teller, holding the check higher than necessary as if it were suspicious evidence. "We'll need to verify this," she announced, her voice just loud enough to draw attention. Whispers stirred behind him. People muttered, eyes narrowing, some smirking. In minutes, Marcus had gone from customer to spectacle. He stayed still. Outwardly calm, inwardly bracing against the sharp edge of humiliation. He knew the trap. If he showed anger, he'd be labeled aggressive. If he protested too firmly, he'd be cast as threatening. Silence, for now, was his shield. but silence did not erase the sting. The second teller studied the check, whispered with the manager, then disappeared to make a phone call. Every second dragged like an hour. Marcus stood alone, surrounded by murmurs, the weight of judgment pressing down heavier with each passing moment. And then, as if the situation weren't degrading enough, the manager laughed again. This time louder, sharper, her smirk widening as she eyed Marcus with a look that said, "You don't belong here. You're out of your depth." The check was real. His account was valid. His presence, however, was the only thing being questioned. Marcus didn't move, didn't flinch. Inside, though, the fire burned hotter, not just for himself, but for what this moment represented. A lifetime of being second-guessed. A lifetime of being forced to prove, again and again, that he was worthy of basic respect. What the manager didn't know, what no one in that room could have imagined, was that the man she mocked wasn't only a customer. He was the one person with power enough to change everything. And soon, that truth would shake the room to its core. The air inside the bank grew heavier by the minute. Marcus stood tall, but inside the storm raged. He could feel the eyes of strangers drilling into him, each second feeding the humiliation. The manager tapped her nails against the counter, still clutching his check like it was a forged relic. "You'll have to wait," she said curtly. No apology, no explanation, just authority wrapped in disdain. Marcus gave a small nod. He wasn't about to cause a scene, but the truth gnawed at him. Why should he have to prove his dignity again? Minutes dragged. Then, the second teller returned, whispering something into the manager's ear. Their eyes flicked toward Marcus, sharp, suspicious, and amused all at once. The manager laughed again, louder, crueler. This wasn't professionalism. It was ridicule. Marcus felt heat crawl up his neck, but he steadied himself. His father's words echoed in his mind. "The world will try to break you, son. Don't give it the satisfaction." Then came the shift. The manager excused herself, leaving Marcus in full view of the crowd. Moments later, 2 uniformed security guards appeared. Heavy steps, stern faces. One rested his hand casually near his holster. "Sir," one guard said firmly, "we've been asked to escort you outside until this is resolved." Gasps rippled through the lobby. Some customers smirked. Others whispered accusations Marcus couldn't hear, but knew too well. Thief. Fraud. Criminal. The labels floated unspoken but heavy in the air. Marcus raised his voice for the first time. "Calm but resolute. I have an account here. That is my check. I've done nothing wrong." The guard's expression didn't change. His grip on Marcus's arm did. As they steered him toward the door, Marcus caught the eyes of a child clutching his mother's hand. The boy stared, wide-eyed, at the sight of a black man being marched out like a criminal. Marcus's chest tightened. It wasn't just about him anymore. That boy was watching, and learning. Outside, the cool air hit his face. But there was no relief. The guard stood firm, blocking his way back in. The manager appeared at the glass doors, phone in hand, smirking as she mouthed something to a colleague. Marcus didn't need to hear the words. He knew the script. The police were being called. A simple errand had spiraled into a public humiliation, and now, potential danger. His mind raced. He thought of his family, his children waiting at home. He thought of headlines, of names turned into hashtags, of lives ended in moments just like this. The sound of sirens in the distance made his pulse quicken. Each wail grew louder, sharper, until 2 squad cars pulled up to the curb. Officers stepped out, hands already near their belts, eyes scanning Marcus with suspicion. "Is this the man?" one officer asked the manager. She nodded confidently, crossing her arms. "Yes." He tried to cash a fraudulent check. The words sliced through Marcus like a blade. Fraudulent. The check was his, signed, legitimate, indisputable. Yet in her voice it became a weapon. Marcus took a slow breath, steadying his voice. "That check is real. That's my money. I have an account here." But the officers didn't approach with understanding. They approached with command. "Hands where we can see them," one barked. The crowd that had gathered outside fell silent, phones raised, some recording. To them, it was entertainment. To Marcus, it was survival. He raised his hands slowly, carefully, each movement deliberate. Any sudden motion could turn suspicion into tragedy. His heart pounded. His dignity shredded. One officer frisked him roughly, ignoring his protests. The other snatched the envelope from his hand, rifling through his identification. "This doesn't look right," the officer muttered, despite the clear matching name and account details. The manager smirked again, arms folded, savoring the scene she had orchestrated. For Marcus, time blurred. Each second stretched endlessly, the humiliation thick, the danger closer. He thought of all the times he had been warned. No matter how successful you become, you'll always have to prove yourself twice over. And now, here he was, successful, respected, accomplished, still reduced to nothing but suspicion. The tension reached its peak when one officer reached for his cuffs. Metal glinted in the sunlight. Gasps echoed again. Marcus's chest tightened. Was this how it would end? But just before the cuffs snapped shut, something shifted. The second officer paused, staring at Marcus's ID again. A flicker of doubt crossed his face. His eyes scanned the name, then the check, then Marcus himself. Recognition dawned slowly, uneasily. "Wait," the officer muttered to his partner. "Do you know who this is?" The crowd leaned in. The guard stiffened. The manager's smirk faltered for the first time. Marcus stood silently, eyes locked on the officer, his dignity battered but unbroken. The turning point was seconds away. And when it came, it wouldn't just change Marcus's fate. It would expose a truth that no one in that crowd would ever forget. The officer holding the cuffs froze, his partner's words cutting through the noise. The crowd murmured, phones still raised, waiting for the spectacle to unfold. The manager shifted uneasily, her smirk fading. The second officer examined the check again. He looked back at Marcus, then at the documents in his hand. His brows furrowed as recognition sank in. The name wasn't just familiar, it carried weight. He cleared his throat. This man isn't who you think he is," the other officer frowned, confused. "What are you talking about?" The second officer held up the check. Marcus Reynolds, CEO of Dominion Bank, the parent bank of this branch. Silence. Heavy. Absolute. The crowd gasped in unison. The security guard stepped back instinctively, their rigid posture collapsing into stunned hesitation. The manager's face drained of color, her confidence evaporating into shock. For Marcus, the moment was bittersweet. He hadn't wanted power to be his shield. He hadn't wanted his title to be his proof of humanity. But now, in this humiliating spectacle, his position became the very thing that exposed their prejudice. The officer lowered the cuffs awkwardly, stepping back as if burned by the weight of his mistake. "Mr. Reynolds, I didn't know." Marcus straightened, his hands still trembling from the violation. His voice was calm, but it cut through the air like steel. "You didn't care to know." The words landed heavy. The crowd stirred uncomfortably. Every eye that had judged him, every whisper that had branded him a criminal, now shifted with shame. The manager stammered, her voice cracking. I was just following protocol, but everyone knew. Protocol hadn't made her laugh. Protocol hadn't summoned security with smug satisfaction. Protocol hadn't called the police on a man who only wanted to cash his check. That was prejudice, raw and unmasked. Marcus turned his gaze on her. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "You laughed at me. You humiliated me. And you did it because of what you saw, not who I am." The manager's lips trembled, but no words came. The officers stood stiffly, caught in the spotlight of their own failure. The crowd's phones stayed up, recording every second, every expression. What had started as an attempt to shame Marcus had become a public unveiling of systemic bias. Marcus reached for his check, reclaiming it with steady hands. His dignity had been tested, battered, nearly destroyed, but not erased. The weight of the moment pressed on everyone present. The realization that they hadn't just misjudged a man. They had exposed the very ugliness so often denied, so often dismissed. But for Marcus, the climax wasn't just about vindication. It was about the bitter truth. If he hadn't been CEO, if his name hadn't carried power, this moment could have ended very differently. He thought of all the others, men and women without titles, without wealth, without a shield of status, who had faced the same humiliation, the same suspicion, and hadn't walked away with proof of innocence. For them, the cuffs hadn't stopped. The sirens hadn't faded. The stories had ended in silence. Marcus's chest tightened as the weight of that truth sank in. His victory in this moment wasn't his alone. It was shadowed by the losses of countless others. The crowd slowly dispersed, some embarrassed, others shaken. But the videos, those would spread. What had happened in that bank wouldn't stay confined to those walls. Marcus walked out of the bank, his head high, his expression calm. But inside, he carried the rage, the sadness, and the burden of knowing that his story was only one among thousands. The climax of that day wasn't just about a bank CEO being humiliated. It was about a mirror being held up to society and forcing everyone to see what stared back. And as Marcus stepped into the daylight, the final words of his father echoed again. "The world will try to break you, son. Don't let it." He hadn't. But the scars left behind were a reminder of how easily it could have gone the other way. The story wasn't over. Not for him, not for anyone. Marcus stepped into the sunlight, his check in hand, but the weight he carried wasn't paper. It was the burden of what had just unfolded. The bank behind him stood silent, its glass doors reflecting not only a building, but a truth too many wanted to ignore. Yes, he had walked out without handcuffs. Yes, his title had shielded him when prejudice tried to strip him bare. But beneath that relief lay a haunting thought. What if he hadn't been the CEO? What if his name hadn't carried weight? For countless others, the ending would have been far darker. The crowd that had once judged him slowly scattered, but their whispers lingered. The videos they had recorded would spread quickly, exposing the manager's smirk, the security guard's aggression, the officer's doubt. People across the city, and beyond, would see the raw truth play out in real time. Marcus knew the headlines that would follow. Bank CEO profiled in his own branch. But he also knew that beyond the headlines was something deeper, an undeniable glimpse into how prejudice operates quietly, shamelessly, and publicly. Back home, Marcus sat at his desk, staring at the check he had fought so hard to prove was his. It wasn't about the money. It was about the principle, the humiliation, the way dignity could be stripped in seconds. He thought of his children. One day they would hear this story, and what lesson would it teach them? That no amount of success could shield them from suspicion? That their skin color would always speak before their voices could? The thought cut him deeply. But then he remembered the little boy in the bank, the one who had watched with wide, frightened eyes as security dragged Marcus toward the door. That boy had witnessed the injustice. He had seen the shame, but he had also seen something else. Marcus standing tall, refusing to crumble, refusing to let prejudice write his story. That, Marcus realized, was where the impact lived. Not in his title, not in the exposure of the manager's cruelty, but in the lessons people would take away. The bank issued a statement days later, apologizing publicly. The manager was placed on leave. The officers were reviewed. But Marcus knew the pattern. Institutions protect themselves first. Accountability comes slow, if at all. Still, the incident sparked conversations. Hard, uncomfortable conversations. In boardrooms, on news panels, across dinner tables, people asked the same question. If this could happen to a CEO, what happens to everyone else? And that was the truth Marcus wanted the world to confront. His story was not an exception. It was a window into the rule. A rule written silently into systems that claim fairness, but practice something else entirely. The humiliation he faced was a single drop in a vast ocean of racial injustice. But every drop creates ripples, and sometimes those ripples grow into waves strong enough to challenge the tide. Marcus knew his fight wasn't over. It couldn't be. Not while others carried the same burden without the shield of status or wealth. He had power, a platform, and a responsibility. So he spoke out, not just for himself, but for the countless others whose voices had been silenced. He told his story to remind people that racism isn't just a relic of the past. It's alive, it's insidious, and it can appear in something as ordinary as cashing a check. The impact of that day stretched far beyond the walls of a single bank. It forced people to see what they often try to look away from. It reminded them that respect shouldn't be earned through titles. It should be granted through humanity. And perhaps most importantly, it left everyone with a choice. Ignore the truth and let the cycle repeat. Or face it and demand change. As Marcus reflected, his father's words returned once more, steady and guiding. The world will try to break you, son. Don't let it. He hadn't let it. But now, he asked the world a question. One that lingers still. If dignity can be stripped so easily from one man, how safe is it for any of us? And more importantly, how much longer will we allow it?